Welcome everyone to the DBSA Peer Leadership Center webinar, Sweet Dreams, the Impact of Sleep on Well-Being. We are so pleased that you have all joined us today. My name is Mary Dean. I'm the Director of Programs at DBSA. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few technical notes. This webinar presentation is being recorded, so everyone is on mute, other than our presenter, Dr. Timothy Bono. We very much would love if you would engage with this presentation by asking questions via the chat box, which is along the side of your screen. As Dr. Bono presents, he'll keep an eye on the questions that come in to answer throughout the presentation, and then we'll do a quick review at the end to make sure that all the questions are covered that we can cover. So those will be addressed at the time remaining at the end. Again, we're so grateful for all of you attending, being a part of the PLC community, and for all the peer support you provide in the world. The DBSA Peer Leadership Center is so pleased to introduce Dr. Timothy Bono. Dr. Bono is a lecturer in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, where his teaching and research focus on positive psychology and college student development. Over the last decade, thousands of students have enrolled in his courses on the Psychology of Young Adulthood and the Science of Happiness. He's the recipient of the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Outstanding Teacher Award for the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and the Outstanding Research Award from the National Association for Orientation, Transition, and Retention in Higher Education. His research and ideas have been featured in a number of media outlets, including Fast Company, CNN, and the Associated Press. He's currently writing a book on happiness in young adulthood, coming out in spring 2018 from Grand Central Publishing. Dr. Bono, thank you so much for being here to share your knowledge and expertise on sleep with the DBSA Peer Leadership Center community.
It is my pleasure, Mary, and thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. So in this presentation, what I'll be doing is providing an overview of some of the science of sleep and why that is such an important behavior for all of us to incorporate to increase our own sense of happiness and well-being in our lives. As Mary mentioned in the introduction, the research and teaching that I do focuses on the science of happiness, and when people ask what are some of the most important things I can do to improve my overall mental health and well-being, sleep, it turns out, is one of the most important things that we can do on a regular basis to get that sense of well-being and happiness. As Mary mentioned, there is the option to ask questions during this presentation, so by all means feel free to type those into the chat box, and I'll be happy to address those as we go along. The presentation itself will probably be maybe 30 minutes or so, if that, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and other reactions that people would like to share at the end. All right, so looks like there was a question, have you started? We are starting right now. So this presentation is going to focus on sleep. Ideally, sleep would look something like this. We'd be like this kitten, all warm and cozy in our beds, and we'd be very comfortable, enjoying a nice cat nap, as they say. But as someone who works on a college campus, I can tell you that most often sleep ends up looking something like this. You have all of these sleep-deprived people catching a nap wherever they possibly can, potentially even in the middle of their meal. A lot of people say that sleep is overrated. They say, yeah, I've heard that sleep is important, but the reality is that I've got too much going on in my life right now to get a good night's sleep on a regular basis. And I can tell you that if you feel that way, you're actually in very good company. It was Margaret Thatcher once who said, sleep is for wimps, or Thomas Edison who once said, sleep is a criminal waste of time. And from his perspective, sleep was just this behavior that was a passive way to take yourself out of the hustle and bustle of daily life. And why waste that time, according to Thomas Edison, when you could be using it for work that would be more productive, for things where you could dedicate that time toward a new invention or business or something else. And this was a commonly held misconception that many people had for a long time, and it's one that many people still believe. But what I hope to do in this presentation is give you a sense of why sleep is important, and in particular highlight the ways that when we are sleeping, our brains are actually incredibly active, and our brains are doing a lot of very important work that have implications both for our cognitive well-being and our ability to stay focused, stay on task toward a particular goal or activity that we need to accomplish during the day, and also it's doing work that can play itself out in our emotional well-being, and that's what we'll really focus on today, the impact for our emotional health when we're getting a good night's sleep on a regular basis. Now, one thing to note about sleep is that it's governed by something called the circadian rhythm, and this is ultimately our biological clock. So there are many bodily rhythms that occur on a 24-hour cycle, including temperature and wakefulness, and so it's important to have a sense of what that rhythm is because we want to align our sleeping patterns as closely as we can to this natural biological clock that we have. If we try to fight nature and sleep at times when we're not actually tired or sleep at times that are not optimal for falling asleep naturally and then waking up feeling well rested, that can interfere with our circadian rhythm. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on, but that's an important thing to keep in mind, that our body has a natural rhythm, and so we want to mimic our sleep patterns to align as much as we can with that natural circadian rhythm that's about 24 hours. Now, in addition to the body itself having these natural bodily rhythms, we also notice that sleep itself has certain characteristic rhythms that it follows over the course of the night. So when we are alert and awake, you'll notice that we have these very short waves over here that we call beta waves. So this is if you're engaged in some activity and you're really concentrating well on it, it's the beta waves that are really active. But as we get tired, if maybe you're feeling this right now, maybe you didn't get enough sleep last night, and so you're starting to feel a little bit tired, like you could fall asleep at any moment, well, that's where we see that these brain waves are starting to slow down a bit. So we have these alpha waves here. Eventually, if we don't do something to wake ourselves up, those brain waves are going to continue to slow down to enter what we call stage 1 sleep. And this is where you might feel the sensation that your body starts to jerk, or you might start to see flashes of light, these hallucinations. That's where the brain waves are slowing down, that you're lulled into a stage of sleep. This is where you could very easily be awakened if you needed to, but you are in fact sleeping. You'll notice that the brain waves continue to slow down, and then they go into stage 2. This is the stage where you're clearly asleep, so it's much harder to wake somebody up from this stage. And this is where sometimes you'll hear, if you have a roommate, you might hear them start to talk. This is the stage where you're asleep enough that the sleep talking may occur. You'll also notice that there are these irregular patterns of activity in the brain, so these sleep spindles or these K complexes. Those are the bursts of neural energy that are effectively blocking out sound and keeping you asleep. That's the reason in stage 1 sleep you can be easily awakened, because you don't have these sleep spindles and K complexes that are blocking out outside noise. As you can see, the brain waves continue to slow down. In stages 3 and 4, you get these nice slow delta waves. This is where it's very hard to be awakened. This is where it would really take somebody shaking you or a loud noise or something to be awakened from that. And ultimately, this is the stage of sleep that we're all going for. If you wake up and you say, man, that was just a really great night's sleep, I slept really, really well, that means that your brain waves were able to slow down to the point where you enjoyed that very nice, deep sleep where it was very difficult to be awakened because those brain waves continue to slow down. In stage 4, this is where you could potentially find sleepwalking that can occur, because it's this automatic behavior that can occur in the middle of the night. So it appears that even though we have these very slow brain waves, it is possible for the body to carry out automatic behaviors, including sleepwalking. There have also been some very interesting incidents that they find Z-mailing or sleep texting, where they have evidence that people will pick up their phones, because for many people that is an automatic behavior, and they'll start texting random people in their phone without even conscious awareness of it. There was a case of a woman who opened up her email and started to invite friends over for dinner the next night, and she didn't even realize that until the next night came around and people showed up at her door because she had invited them over. It was this automatic behavior that she was carrying out in the middle of the night during stage 4 sleep. The reason why I went into all of that detail about the brain waves is because our ability to fall asleep is predicated on the brain's ability to slow down. And so if we have difficulty falling asleep, it's very important for us to think about what we might be doing right before we want to go to sleep that is preventing those brain waves from slowing down. So for example, if you're spending a lot of time, any sort of screen time right before bed is a really bad idea, because light, access to light, especially if we're looking at a mobile device right in front of our face, a lot of people, even after they get into bed, will reach for their phone and be checking email or scrolling through social media or doing other things where you have all this light that's entering your visual system, that light is preventing the brain from going from the beta waves down to the alpha waves down to those slower theta waves. So if ever you should find yourself having difficulty falling asleep, the first thing to do is to think about, well, what am I doing in the hour or so before sleep that could be keeping my brain really active? And so you want to do activities that don't involve a whole lot of stimulation, that don't involve a lot of light going into the visual system, because that's one way to ensure that those brain waves will be able to slow down so that eventually they can progress down to this very slow wave of sleep down here at the bottom. All right, now an interesting thing happens after you have a full cycle of sleep. So it takes maybe about an hour or so to go from this alert state of wakefulness down to these slower brain waves down here in stages 3 and 4. Instead of the brain waves continuing to slow down over the course of the night, an interesting thing happens where they start to cycle back up. So you're awake, they start to slow down to these alpha waves, you fall asleep at stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. About an hour in, the brain waves start to shorten a little bit, and they become a little bit more active. So it goes from stage 4 to stage 3 to stage 2 to stage 1, and then we enter something called REM sleep. And you may have heard about REM sleep. Any time that people talk about sleep in popular news articles, they usually talk about REM at some point. And REM is an acronym for rapid eye movement sleep. And the reason it's called that is because if you look at the eyelids of someone who's experiencing REM sleep, that's what their eyes are doing. This is where you might have really vivid dreams. If you had a nightmare last night or you had some really crazy dream that was high intensity, those generally happen during REM sleep. And we know that this period is often called paradoxical sleep because if you look at the pattern of brain activity when we are fully awake, that is almost exactly the same pattern of brain activity that we experience when we are in REM sleep. So if you look at the pattern of brain activity during REM sleep, it mimics almost exactly that we have during this alertfulness stage. And we call this paradoxical sleep because this is, in fact, the deepest form of sleep. It's very difficult to wake somebody up during this sleep. And yet, for some reason that we're not exactly sure why, it seems to mimic our brain waves when we are alert. Now, we know that it's associated with a high level of brain activity, and in particular, it's associated with memory consolidation and emotion regulation. So this is part of the reason why after we've learned something, so if you have a job where you're learning a lot of tasks, or if you are a student and you're learning a lot of things at school, it's really important to get a full night's sleep that includes a healthy dose of REM sleep, because it is during this stage of sleep in particular that the brain is strengthening key neural circuits that help to consolidate those memories so that that information is available to you if you have to take a test on the material or otherwise use that material in your life the next day. It's also associated with emotion regulation. So this is the reason why if we haven't gotten a good night's sleep, often the next day we are a little bit on edge, we're very moody, we don't get along with people as well. Even small little things can be really upsetting to us. The reason for that is because it is during this period of REM sleep that the brain is strengthening those parts of the brain that help us to regulate those emotions and not be quite as responsive as things might have been. So to people like Margaret Thatcher and Thomas Edison who said, oh, sleep's not that important, it's a waste of time, actually the brain is incredibly active, as you can see here, and this brain activity is helping us both on a cognitive level with our memories and also to help us to regulate our emotional well-being. All right, so another way to look at these stages of sleep is through this graph right here. And what you'll notice is that in this awake state, this is where you have this very high intensity brain activation period, and then it slows down. And again, it takes roughly an hour or so to get down to this very deep level of sleep down here in stage 4. And then again, it cycles back up. So it's about an hour and a half in or so that you get that REM period, and then it continues to cycle down and then back up and down and up over the course of the night. So usually we have 4 to 5 cycles per night. And what we notice is that over the course of a full night's sleep, so ideally we're getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, is that our time in stages 3 and 4 decreases. So you have time in stages 3 and 4 in the first few hours, but over the last couple of hours we're not getting down to stages 3 and 4. And what that allows is for these durations of REM sleep, remember this is the really important stage of sleep, those periods become longer over the course of the night. So the first sleep cycle over here, you might be having a REM cycle that's maybe 10 minutes or so. By the end of the night, this final REM cycle is closer to 30 minutes. So you're getting a very healthy dose of REM sleep by the end of the night. So this is where some people will say, oh, I'll try to catch like a 2-hour nap over here, and then later I'll get 3 hours later, and then maybe at night I'll sleep for 4 hours or something. Well, even though that might add up to 8 hours altogether, it's not the same as getting a full 8 hours in one fell swoop, because over the course of the night, remember those REM periods are increasing, and so you're getting that added benefit of all of the memory consolidation and emotion regulation that's happening in the brain when we get that full 8 hours of sleep, and those REM cycles are much longer by the end. Now, this also has implications for things like napping. So people often say, well, what happens if I don't get a full night's sleep and I have to take a nap? A day with a nap is a very good thing to do if you're able to do it, but you want to be very careful about the timing of that nap, because there are many people who will tell you that sometimes they take a nap and they wake up from the nap actually feeling worse. They feel groggy, they feel even more tired. So when you're going to take a nap, you want to wake up within 20 minutes or make sure that you've got at least 90 minutes to devote to the nap. And the reason for that is because if you pay attention to these stages up here, it takes about 15 or 20 minutes to get into stage 2 sleep. Well, remember that the brain waves are slowing down over the course of the night, which means that if you take a nap that's about 1 hour in length, what that means is that within an hour or so, your brain waves are so slow that if you try to wake up right here, that's where you get this jolt. You feel like you've been hit by a ton of bricks, because your brain is having to adjust from these very slow waves to here all the way up to these awake brain waves here, and that jolt can be very difficult for your brain to try to figure out what to do there. So that's where people will often feel very groggy if they take a nap within 45 to 60 minutes, because you're going from stage 4 all the way up to here. To feel well rested, we want to wake up in stages 1 or 2, but ideally in stage 1 sleep, because this is where the brain waves are already pretty close to the awake stage up here. So if you're going to take a nap, you want to do it within 15 to 20 minutes, because that way you're still in stage 1 when you wake up, or within 90 minutes or so. Usually by 90 minutes, that's where people are back up to this stage 1 sleep. And again, the brain waves are going to be very close to their awake state at the top of the graph. The other thing I'll mention about the timing of a nap, and obviously this one isn't as feasible because a lot of people have commitments in the middle of the afternoon, but our circadian rhythm is set up such that there is a natural dip in our alertness around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is why a lot of cultures, including many parts of Europe, will have a siesta in the middle of the afternoon, because it's simply mapping onto a natural dip in our circadian rhythm where we start to feel tired anyway. And so often they will close down and allow people to go home and catch a quick nap before coming back to work for the rest of the day. So if you have the flexibility in your schedule to place a nap anywhere you can, a 20-minute nap at 3 o'clock in the afternoon there is a very good way to catch a second wind. Now, if you are trying to mimic, or I should say if you're trying to align your sleep patterns in such a way that they mimic the body's natural rhythm, the good news is that there's an app for that. So I believe that you can get a lot of these free or cheap. I'll mention I'm not making any profit by advertising this, but this is one thing that one of my students brought to my attention actually, where there's this app that you can put on a mattress, and it mimics, or I should say it is able to figure out the body's natural rhythm and map the movement of the body onto which stage of sleep that you're in, so that it is able to predict at what time in the morning you're going to be most likely in stage 1 sleep, so that you can wake up during stage 1 and feel the most well-rested. If ever you wake up in the morning and you just don't feel very well rested, that's an indication that you probably are waking up in stages 2 or 3 or potentially even stage 4. The ability to wake up feeling well rested requires that we're waking up pretty close to stage 1 sleep. So this app essentially is able to make a prediction based on your movement throughout the night at what time you're most likely to be in stage 1 sleep, and then it'll wake you up pretty close to there. I'll also share with you some research that's been done looking at sleep not only for our psychological health but also as an indicator of other disorders or diseases that people can develop. So there was a study done a couple of years ago showing that there's a marker for Alzheimer's disease that they have been able to link to how much sleep people are getting. So I'll read you some quotes from this article here. They say that sleep deprivation has negative effects on cognitive function comparable to that of alcohol intoxication, and many of us have felt that way. If you've stayed up too long, it's difficult. Your words get slurred. It's difficult even to walk in a straight line or think clearly. Very similar to what happens if you've had too much alcohol. Prolonged sleep disruption and deprivation can actually play an important role in pathological processes that underlie diseases they're finding, and in particular, better sleep may be helpful in reducing Alzheimer's disease risk. Ultimately, one of the things that we know about Alzheimer's disease is that it is ultimately a brain disease, and that it involves the accumulation of toxins that can interfere with the brain's ability to fire connections back and forth between the neural circuits. And when we sleep, sleep appears to be one thing that is able to clear out all of those toxins that accumulate. And over the long run, over the course of a lifetime, if we're able to clear those out on a regular basis, that has been shown to reduce a disease like Alzheimer's. I also just want to share with you, the authors of this news article had great fun describing the study for you. I just want to read a few excerpts to you. So the researchers placed some flies in vials with up to 40 others. Don Leah, the scientist's name, schooled male flies about rejection to show that sleep was important for learning social skills. He placed a virgin male fly in a vial with a female who had already mated and wasn't up for further action. The hapless male performed a mating dance and rubbed his wings together to serenade his potential mate, Shaw, the other scientist, said. After repeatedly crashing and burning, the male gave up. The researchers allowed some flies to sleep after the session and kept others awake by nudging them whenever they settled down to nap. 2 days later, the researchers put the males in vials with virgin female flies. Only the flies who napped after making failed passes learned that the females were just not that into them. Sleep-deprived flies made moves on the new females as if they'd never been shot down. So in addition to having great fun writing this article, this is also illustrating how part of the work that the brain is doing when we sleep has implications for logical thinking and having a sense of how others might be experiencing us and perceiving us. So if you have an important decision to make, the old adage, sleep on it, there's good scientific evidence to suggest that that is, in fact, a good way to go. All right, let's take a look at a bit of a more specific look at the implications for sleep and memory consolidation. So one thing we know about sleep is that it increases activity in brain regions like the frontal lobe. So the brain is split into all these different lobes, and we know that memories are shifted to storage regions more efficiently over the course of a night's sleep. So that's the cognitive level. We also know that sleep decreases other brain regions like the limbic system. These are the structures of the brain right below the cortex, and that's in particular associated with emotions and anxiety. So part of the reason why we often can feel highly emotional or highly anxious on a day that follows a sleepless night, that's because those regions of the brain in the limbic system are too active, and the brain did not have enough of an opportunity to quiet those down over the course of the night. So again, it's all part of the work that the brain is doing. We know that there are major neurotransmitters that are secreted during sleep. In particular, serotonin. This one's associated with mood. So this is a neurochemical that the brain naturally produces, and during sleep in particular, there's a lot of that is produced. So if we shortchange the amount of sleep that we're getting, we're not allowing the brain enough time and an opportunity to release this neurotransmitter. Also, norepinephrine. This is a neurotransmitter that's associated with vigilant concentration. This is why after a sleepless night, we often have difficulty focusing on a given task at hand. It's because, again, we didn't give the brain enough time to release this neurotransmitter that's associated with concentration and the ability to stay on task toward our goals. There's also been research looking at the impact of sleep deprivation in the United States. So just a few facts for you. Each year, sleep-related accidents cost about $50 billion in terms of the impact they have on the damages that come from that, either on the roads or in the workplace. People who fall asleep on the job or fall asleep behind the wheel can cause major accidents that are very expensive. It causes approximately 25,000 deaths each year, and more than 2.5 million people are injured each year due to these accidents from people who were sleep deprived. So These are all correlational data. Well, I think that we could make a case that they are, in fact, from the sleep. But scientists have become very clever in trying to understand what happens when you manipulate how much sleep people get. And there's essentially a natural way to conduct this study, and it's with daylight savings time. So this will be happening, I think, in just another week and a half or so. We spring forward where we lose an hour of sleep, and scientists have looked at that. What is the impact of something like daylight savings where everybody's now losing an hour of sleep? So I don't think we planned the timing of this webinar in this way, but in some ways it's actually perfect timing because this is about to happen, so we have to brace ourselves. So this was a scientific article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was based on Canadian data traffic accidents. And they looked at the Monday of the week before the change, so that would be this coming Monday, just a few days from now. And then they looked at the Monday right after the change. And then they looked at the Monday a week later. So they're comparing the number of accidents that occur on the road both before and after people have lost an hour of sleep. And what you find is that, sure enough, immediately after, so the Monday after daylight savings time, there are significantly more accidents on the roads than right before or right after that. So people have adjusted essentially a week after this shift. But just a day or two following the shift, that's where you see a lot of people causing more accidents. So this is telling us that losing 1 hour of sleep in the spring is increasing the number of traffic accidents, and it goes back to the work that the brain is doing when we sleep. It's so important for our cognition and our ability to pay attention to what's around us. If we're not getting enough sleep, that compromises our ability to pay as close attention as we could otherwise. Now, they also do this in the fall, so this is where people fall back. They get an extra hour of sleep, and here you find that, sure enough, immediately after, there are actually fewer accidents than there are in the weeks before or after sleep. So gaining an hour of sleep in the fall is decreasing the number of traffic accidents, and it's essentially telling us that we all operate under a chronic sleep deficit, that when we can position ourselves to get more sleep, as we do in the fall shift where we're getting an opportunity to get an extra hour of sleep, that improves our performance. If we can find other ways to structure our day to allow more time for sleep, it plays itself out both on this cognitive level and also on this emotional level. There's just one more study that I want to share with you, and then we'll open it up to any questions that people might have. This is actually a study that I conducted a couple of years ago. So I'm a faculty member at Washington University in St. Louis, and every fall I do a study with a group of about 100 students of mine where they complete weekly surveys on what their emotional and psychological and cognitive experience is like as they're transitioning into college. So these are all college freshmen, and on this graph here, the y-axis is going to plot the number of hours of sleep that they report. And on the x-axis down here are the 15 weeks of the semester. So this is the first week in August, and then September, October, November, December to the end of the semester. So because these students are completing these surveys every single week, this allows me to see where the ups and downs are over the course of the semester. And what you find is that the first week of the semester, students come in and they're getting on average about 7 hours of sleep. But you can see what happens to this value over the first month and a half of school. It goes way down. It continues to sort of bump around a little bit, but mostly at this low level. It hits a spike at week 14. In case you're wondering what that is, week 14 is Thanksgiving. So most of the students are able to go home. There aren't any classes that week, so people go home. They catch up on sleep. You would think that everybody would realize, oh, sleep is so wonderful. I'm going to prioritize this as a behavior that I continue. But people come back for the very final week of the semester, and it's right back to this very low level. So not surprising that this is what the pattern looks like. But in addition to looking at just the sheer pattern of sleep over the course of the semester, we also are able to see, well, what else is going on in the students' lives? So remember, there are other variables that they're responding to in terms of their academic commitments, how engaged they are at school, how they feel about their overall college transition. And here are the strongest correlates. So the single strongest correlate that students report on the weeks when they get more sleep is that they feel more in charge. And the opposite of that is feeling overwhelmed. And so now when people ask me, or I should say when students come into my office and they tell me how overwhelmed they feel, I now will tell them, I should say I ask them, how much sleep have you been getting? And reliably, it is the students who report feeling most overwhelmed, who have been pulling all-nighters and not getting enough sleep. I'll also just mention I do see the question on sleep hygiene, and I will be very happy to answer that in just a minute. All right, I'm just going to go through a couple more of these correlations. They also report more positive emotions. They're happier, they're less anxious on weeks when they've been getting more sleep. They're more engaged at school. This is consistent with what we know about cognition and our ability to stay focused on a particular task. If we've been getting more sleep, we've got more of those neurotransmitters that ultimately help us to stay focused on our work. And then finally, they feel more optimistic about the upcoming week. If they've been sleeping better, if they have a paper or a test coming up the next week, they feel more optimistic that things are going to go their way. So to people like Margaret Thatcher and Thomas Edison who say sleep is a waste of time, sleep is for wimps, well, it turns out that that time that we dedicate to sleep is ultimately incredibly important on both an emotional level and a cognitive level. To anybody who says, I have too much work to do to get sleep in my schedule, I would say your brain has too much work to do for you not to prioritize your sleep patterns. All right, so now at this point I'm happy to answer questions that have been coming in. So there's a question here from Dagger. Can you explain sleep hygiene? Are there things a person can do to get a better night's rest? And it turns out that there certainly are. One thing is that there's a national sleep institution that has a whole list of them that you could Google, but I think that one of the most important things is that you want sleep to be as much of a routine as possible. So to the extent that you can get yourself into a particular habit, that maybe you have meals at a particular time, or maybe you meditate, or you do some other behavior leading up to sleep, that's essentially training your body and your mind to know, okay, this is the time where I'm about to go to sleep, and so it'll start to shut down. One thing in particular to be mindful of, there are a lot of people who watch TV in bed, or they bring work to do in bed, or they do other things in bed. You don't want to do anything in bed except sleep, because otherwise, if you get in the habit that you come home at 6 o'clock in the afternoon and immediately you like to lie down in your bed because it's nice and comfortable, and that's where you choose to read a book, or that's where you do other things, then your brain forms an association between lying down in bed and being alert so that it can read the book or do work or check email. So you want to protect your bed as only a place where you go to sleep, so that your body is trained when you get into bed, that's where you're going to sleep. Another thing to do is, to the extent that you can, you want to go to bed and wake up at the same time every single day, and that includes weekends. I mean, it's nice to sleep in, a little bit, but one thing that we've been finding even in the last couple of years is that sleep variability turns out to be a detriment to our cognitive well-being and our overall sense of health and happiness. So to the extent that you can be getting the same amount of sleep based on going to bed and waking up at the same time, also very important. Another thing with sleep hygiene, and I hit on this one a little bit earlier, but it bears repeating, is to pay attention to what you're doing immediately before bed. Think about what activities you might be doing that are keeping the brain active. So I would, if you're having difficulty falling asleep, try not to have any screen time of any kind in the hour before bed. So that would be no TV, nothing on the computer, because it's not just the mental activity of paying attention to the TV or reading a news article or checking email, but it's also just the amount of light that's going into your visual system. And at very least, I would say, once you get into bed, as tempting as it might be, do not reach for your phone or any other mobile device and bring that into bed with you. Because again, it's both the mental activity of reading those things and responding, but also just the amount of light that goes into your visual system. We know that light suppresses the release of melatonin, which is an important neurochemical that helps us to feel tired and go to sleep. And so all that light is only keeping us up even longer. So those are a couple of tips right there. Make it a habit. Pay attention to what's going on right before bed, and reduce your exposure to light as much as you possibly can. All right. Let's see. There's a question from Lucy. Why do some people have a spike of energy later at night and feel tired earlier in the evening? I experience this, and I'm wondering what I can do. Yeah, it's a very good question. It likely has something to do with the circadian rhythm, that there are just these natural patterns in the body's fluctuation in alertness and tiredness levels. One thing, so part of it could just be biological, but one thing that I would encourage you to do is to pay attention to any activities that you might be doing right before you notice this spike. So if it's really encumbering you and preventing you from falling asleep at night, one thing to do would be just for a week or two, keep a journal when you get home in the evening, and try to, maybe like once an hour, write down what you've been doing in that hour and how tired you feel, and see if you notice any patterns. Because some people, based on what time they eat, when the body metabolizes food, that can cause them to feel a little bit more tired. Or some people, when they get home, if they spend time with a roommate or other family members or something who are there, that can affect their alertness levels as well. Some people get home and they immediately go for the couch, or they immediately do something else. That, again, that exposure to light or the mental activity can cause them to increase their alertness levels. I've seen some research recently showing that many people will feel very tired, and then right before they fall asleep, they can't fall asleep because suddenly they went from feeling tired to very alert. And what that has been linked to is brushing your teeth under the bright light of the mirror, of the lights above the mirror in the bathroom. So even something, again, just our exposure to light really has a huge impact on our tiredness level. So I would encourage you just to pay attention to what precedes spikes in alertness or feelings of tiredness, and see then if you can make some modifications. There are some people now who just brush their teeth in the dark, or they have as little ambient light as possible, because they know that those really bright lights in the bathroom can cause them from going to feeling tired right before bed to feeling really alert. So just pay attention to those patterns as you notice them. There's a question about when nightmares are experienced, does this disturb the REM? So in all likelihood, those nightmares are occurring during REM sleep, because those are the really vivid dreams. So if you've had a nightmare, that's an indication that that's happening during, in all likelihood anyway, it's happening during REM sleep. And it could disrupt REM if it wakes you up. Now, very likely it's not going to wake you up until the end of the REM cycle, but some nightmares can feel so intense that it activates regions of the brain that actually believe that this is actually happening, and then that can cause someone to awaken. We've all experienced that. And to the extent that it's possible, you want to lull yourself back to sleep and maybe just take a few breaths. That's not the time to reach for your phone. That's not the time to get all worked up. If you can prevent that, again, it's all about just trying to lull yourself back to sleep and catch the rest of the night's sleep as best as you can. And then I'll also just mention as an aside here, there's something called the muscle paralysis. So the reason why we don't act out our dreams is because the brain is able to essentially shut down the activation of the muscles in our bodies during sleep. And this is also the reason why sometimes people will wake up and they feel paralyzed. They can't move their muscles. If that hasn't happened to you, it probably will happen to you at some point. It's very common. And it can be really unnerving because you can't move your body. What that means is that you woke up in the middle of REM sleep, and you just have to wait a minute or two for your body to catch up with your brain, and then you'll be able to move again. But if ever you wake up and you cannot move, it just means that you woke up in the middle of REM sleep. It was muscle paralysis, which happens every night, but essentially your brain woke up before your body did. Okay, there's a question from Ronald. I have REM sleep behavior disorder. If I have an active night, I feel badly well into the day. Does that make sense? And any recommendations? I will admit that I am not an expert on REM sleep behavior disorder. If I have an active night, I feel badly well into the day. Unfortunately, I'm not the person to answer this question. I can offer some guesses here, but it would really tie back to a lot of the sleep hygiene that we've been talking about so far. And hopefully you're working with a sleep specialist who can help you with that. There's a lot of stuff that we just don't know about sleep, and especially a lot of the sleep disorders that occur. And it does make sense that if you have an active night where you're not able to get that REM sleep, you feel badly for all the reasons that we've outlined. And you might pay attention to see if there are certain behaviors that might be keeping your brain up. But in terms of disordered REM sleep, it would probably have to be a specialist who could provide you insight there. I'm sorry I'm not able to provide a more specific idea in response to your question. Elizabeth says, do you have recommendations for how a narcoleptic person can get to sleep? I'm still struggling even with the help of medication. Yeah, gosh, this is 2 in a row where, sleep in many ways, for as much as we know about sleep and the disorders, there's actually more that we don't know about those disorders. And narcolepsy in particular is one that is difficult to keep under control. So I think that a sleep specialist is certainly going to know more than I will. But I think that it very likely boils down to a lot of the sleep hygiene that we have, that we've been talking about here, in terms of trying to pay attention to screen time and making sure that you are engaging in regular routines in terms of what time you're going to bed and getting a full night's sleep on a regular basis. All right, and then Vincent says, please talk about the relationship between poor sleep and mental health issues. Yeah, so we do know that this is one where it can often turn into a cycle where a lack of sleep can cause people to not feel as good about themselves, but also anxiety and depression by their very nature can also prevent people from getting a good night's sleep because they're staying up ruminating or they're anxious about things into the future. So we do know that that's a symptom, that often when people have large and sustained disruptions in their sleep patterns, that can often be an indication that there's a mood disorder that they are struggling with or an anxiety disorder. And that's where often a mental health professional, one of the strategies, in addition to the many other interventions that are available, will be to help to regulate the sleep pattern. So there's absolutely an association there. If you have a more specific question, I'd be happy to answer that. But yes, there certainly is an association. And to the extent that someone can incorporate behaviors that allows them to regulate their sleeping, that can go a long way in being a good first step to helping reduce at least some of the symptoms that go along with those disorders. All right, now we have from Elizabeth, what do you think about listening to music before bed, either with or without lyrics? Is that also disruptive in slowing down brainwaves? That's an excellent question, and it really depends on the person. So it's all a question of, is this kind of like white noise that that is in fact slowing down the brainwaves, or are you listening to some heavy metal rock punk band that is so loud and has such an irregular rhythm to it that it's keeping you up at night? But there are a lot of people, I personally will like to have the TV on, and that I find if I keep it on at a very low level, it kind of lulls me to sleep, because of that white noise that essentially will direct my brain away from any distracting or thoughts that are trying to interfere with my ability to fall asleep. And it can be very, very effective. So I think that it's something where you should try it for you, and for a lot of people having something, whether it's TV or music on in the background, yeah, that can be very effective in bringing those brain waves down to that slower level. Vincent is back. Doesn't the relationship work both ways? And the answer is yes, it absolutely does work both ways. So a lack of sleep can exacerbate the symptoms of depression, and we also know that people who are depressed or anxious, again, those disorders themselves can interrupt people's sleep patterns. So it is certainly a two-way street in the case of people who have a disorder. And for people who suffer from depression in particular, we know that can involve not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep, and it can also go the other direction where they're sleeping 18 or 20 hours a day for an extended period of time, in which case working with a mental health counselor can help to regulate those experiences. Those are excellent questions. If there's any more, I think we do have another minute or two to go over those.
Dr. Bono, this is Mary. I'm actually wondering, I tried to enter it in to mark it as a question, but it stayed in the chat towards you. But I'm wondering if you could share anything about how sleep may impact diet and vice versa. So something along the lines of if you're a lack of sleep leading to craving, or kind of on a different flip side, if eating certain things may disrupt sleep for people, and what the cause and kind of background on that might be. And that hopefully will give people a chance to add a couple more questions if they have them.
Yeah. So that's another really good question. It's not something that I've seen a huge amount of research on myself, but we do know that there are some foods, and this is going to vary by the individual, that are disruptive to the digestive system. And so that means that as your body is metabolizing those foods over the course of the night, it can cause such discomfort that it could potentially wake somebody up. And so we want to be mindful about those foods that could be disagreeable to us. And then, there's also stuff on alcohol before bed that it might help you fall asleep, but it might not, but it doesn't help you remain asleep over the course of the night. Again, I'm not as well versed on that research itself. But we do know that as the body is metabolizing food, it I mean, because of the energy that's required to do that, that will often make people a little bit more tired. And so that's one of the things, if you notice just in your day-to-day routines, that that's causing you to become tired at times when you don't want to be tired, or vice versa. You want to pay attention to the timing of the meals. But in terms of specific foods that are associated with sleep, as I understand it, it's more about the individual person and sort of what your body finds to be agreeable or not. But again, that's a bit out of my wheelhouse in terms of the expertise there. I'm sure that there's been research that's been conducted on it, but that's about the extent of my knowledge with it. Great question from Elizabeth. Can exercise help bodies override that second wind that can appear in the evening? Excellent, excellent question. The answer is yes. So exercise is another really important behavior for our overall sense of happiness and well-being, and exercise in particular is very closely linked to our ability to fall asleep and remain asleep, because that helps our body to feel tired. If we stay in all day, and I've completely acknowledge that for some people, especially those suffering from a mood disorder, it can be very difficult to have the motivation to get up and do exercise. But if we do have the motivation to get up and even take a brisk 20-minute walk in the middle of the day, that is one thing that by the end of the day our body feels physically tired, and it can help us to fall asleep and remain asleep. And also that second wind that you're talking about, one of the interesting things we know about exercise is that the act of exercising itself increases mitochondria, which are essentially the energy stores in our body cells. So it's this interesting paradox where the act of expending energy on exercise actually gives us more energy because the mitochondria is increasing in those cells. So that's one reason why, if you're at work and you can't go home to take a nap at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if you are able to take just a 10-minute break and take a quick walk, and especially if it's a nice day outside and you're able to get some sunshine, that's an excellent way to catch a second wind, because that simple act of exercise actually increases our energy. And exercise over the course of the day, people who incorporate a good amount of exercise during the day are often able to fall asleep and have a better night's sleep, because the body is physically tired. It has an easier time falling asleep at night. So thank you for the question, Elizabeth. Very, very good point.
At this time, if anyone has any final questions, now is your chance to enter them in. If not, we'll close the webinar for the day. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bono. This presentation was fantastic. I learned a lot myself, so I am very grateful. And thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today for being here, and as well as for being a part of the DBSA Peer Leadership Center community. The recording of this webinar will be held on PLC through the member portal under webinars. It should be posted in the coming days, so feel free to reference back, share it with others who you're working with, spread these tips about things like sleep hygiene. I hope you all have a great day, and thank you again for being here.
Thanks, everybody.